Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Y, greeting you from China. As everyone knows, the trade friction between the US and China has been going on for some time, and recently it has intensified. We saw President Trump talk again and again about significantly raising tariffs. I think now the tariffs on Chinese goods could exceed 100%. In response, the official statement from China's Ministry of Commerce was quite strongly worded, vowing countermeasures and accusing the US of quote-unquote doubling down on mistakes. The most direct short-term manifestation of this escalating conflict is its impact on financial markets. We've seen volatility in the US and European markets, and China's A-share markets here has also been affected. Well, I personally lost quite a bit too. Observing the stock market, I was reminded of the first US-China trade war during President Trump's first term. It's very interesting. There are some similarities between these two instances. As someone living here, I want to share my perspective, well, not as an expert, but simply as an ordinary Chinese person and probably investor, to chat with you about what I see the Chinese media talking about, what people around me are talking about, and what China's money is talking about. Speaking of the stock market, to truly understand the Chinese market's current reaction, I think knowing a bit about its history is helpful. It's very different from markets in Europe or the US. For a long time, many observers, including people within China, felt that China's A-share market didn't truly reflect the country's economic reality. China's GDP grew rapidly for decades, but the stock market often seemed sluggish or disconnected. Because for many years, the stock market wasn't really seen by the officials as a major tool for ordinary people's wealth creation. Instead, it was basically just a financing platform, serving those large state-owned enterprises, those big companies owned by the government with roots in the old planned economy system. These enterprises have huge market caps, but extremely poor profitability. For a long time, Chinese officials used the stock market as a tool to give blood transfusion and extended the life of these bloated enterprises. But things seem to have changed. What I've noticed over the past 5 to 8 years is a gradual shift in the official attitude. It feels like officials increasingly recognize that a healthier stock market could actually help boost domestic consumption. This year, I've seen more and more official information linking stock market raising with improving people's living standards. During the market downturns these past few days, officials also actively released positive news to soothe investor sentiment. All signs indicate that there now seems to be more emphasis on linking market vitality with the confidence of ordinary investors. Because of this shift, today's stock market might reflect official attitudes or economy priorities more than it did in the past. That's also why observing this reaction to events like trade tensions now might tell us something different than it would have 10 years ago. Before this latest round of trade tension heated up again, China's A-share market had already been through a rather difficult period, about 1 or 2 years of downturn, so it wasn't starting from a high point when facing this impact. And this whole situation actually reminds me a bit of early 2020, right when the COVID-19 pandemic was starting to explode globally. At that time, the impact of the first US-China trade war was still ongoing, and the whole world was panicking about the pandemic. But China implemented very strict control measures, containing the virus relatively quickly within its borders. When other parts of the world were still shut down, China restarted a significant portion of its production and export capacity. The Chinese stock market, because it had already been sluggish for some time before the pandemic hit, was considered undervalued by many people. So the Chinese stock market didn't crash. Instead, it rose quite rapidly during that period. Now I guess we're once again facing a situation like that. Now the A market has been sluggish for a while, bringing valuations back to relatively low level, and the US-China trade war has restarted. we are again facing uncertainty for sudden events. My guess is that this time, the Chinese stock market will still, after a short-term dip, begin to turn around. The outbreak of US-China economic conflict will become the catalyst. Okay, beyond market data, I want to talk more about the words and emotions of every ordinary person. Based on my observations, mainly from online discussions and daily conversations, I feel the public sentiment is subtly different compared to when the trade conflict first really heated up during Trump's first term. I remember back then, around 2018 or 2019, online discussions were also very intense. I could feel a stronger sense of anxiety or perhaps unease, worrying about what this sudden economic conflict meant for China and people's lives. The tone often felt quite agitated, with all sorts of strong opinions flying around. But this time, it seems that the widespread anxiety from back then is gone. The dominant emotion I capture more often now is, perhaps, impatience. This impatience doesn't seem to stem merely from disappointment and helplessness, but rather carries a tone of nonchalance, maybe even a bit of disdain towards the conflict itself. I talk with many of my friends, they're actually not interested with all this news. When I talked about tariffs, they reacted like, this routine again? No other tricks? This shifted from the anxiety a few years ago to this almost dismissive impatience now is quite interesting to ponder. It might indicate that people aren't taking this threat as seriously as before, perhaps even underestimating the opponent or the potential impact of the conflict, viewing it more as an annoying nuisance than a grave danger. And I feel that although President Trump might hope to portray the tariff policy as highly threatening, in Chinese public opinion, his way of doing things often appears increasingly theatrical. It feels like his performance sometimes makes people lose focus on the tariffs themselves, turning the whole thing into just another topic for casual chat or online memes. Now within China, there seems to be an emerging narrative. People seem increasingly less concerned about how much substantial harm the US can inflict on China, especially economically. A view is becoming more common that the US has actually alienated its own allies and is gradually losing its global influence. Sometimes the perception is that the US is finding it hard to rally support, and perhaps the only thing it's good at is pressuring smaller, weaker nations. According to this narrative, China is seen as weathering the storm, perhaps even gaining new allies. And this growing confidence, this budding optimism, if it truly takes hold, its impact might extend beyond just casual chat. It could start shaping future expectations about the economy and China's place in the world. And also, it could eventually provide some underlying support for market sentiment. These are only my observations about the market sentiment, social narratives, and historical similarities. They are not predictions. The reality of friction between major powers is complex and dangerous, and the actual outcomes are genuinely hard to predict. Although the current narrative within China might lean towards optimism or downplay risks, I will still remain cautious. Specifically, if the US can effectively repair relationships with its key allies, and if they can coordinate and jointly apply economic pressure on China, that scenario could be very difficult for China to navigate. Ultimately, the situation remains fluid and uncertain. Sharing these observations is just my way of offering a perspective as an ordinary person living here in China. This is a terrible era, full of uncertainty, but perhaps it's also an era for us to start truly paying attention to the world and to how people living in other parts of the world think. I hope to see your thoughts in the comments section. Which country are you from? What are your thoughts on this global market shock? How long do you expect the US-China tariff war to last? Alright, that's all from today. If there are any new developments in China, I'm happy to provide updates anytime. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.